The fortress of Louisburg stands out on a damp, marshy peninsula on the east coast of the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, a symbol of the bitter 18th century struggle between Britain and France for control of the North American continent. The French went inland along the St. Lawrence River and then down the Mississippi. The British controlled the coast. By 1720, the French coastal presence had been reduced to the island of Cape Breton, or Ile Royale as the French called it, where at Louisburg they built the most powerful fortress on the continent to that time.
Vive le roi! Vive le roi! Compagnie French de Louisbourg! Présentez vos armes!
The fortress was built on the land of the Micmac and Abenaki Indians, but under French military protection, it quickly became one of the busiest ports on the continent, with 150 ships visiting the busy harbor every year. From Louisburg, French ships could sail north to control access to the St. Lawrence River. From Louisburg, the French could raid New England villages, farms, and fishing ports, and frequently did. Louisburg became the key to the North Atlantic and to the defense of New France, as the French called Canada. The influence of this remarkable fortress, built at immense cost by the French, lasted for only 4 decades. But in that time, 3 armies, the conscripted armies of Britain and France, along with the volunteer army from the New England colonies, were involved in the struggle to control Louisburg.
In the early 18th century, at the time of Louisburg's heyday, colonists in North America looked to the sea for their main resource. It hadn't yet got to the point where the great push was to the inland to move in and develop the interior settlements of North America. The sea and the fishery particularly was of prime importance to New England and also, of course, to the French colonies, to Cape Breton and to Louisburg. To maintain access to the cod fisheries, the French had to have access to it through an ice-free port. And this harbor here at Louisburg was ice-free during the winter. It had a pretty uncomfortable climate, but France needed a port or a location somehow that guarded the mouth of St. Lawrence, that had access to the cod fisheries, and was a major transshipment point, the key qualities that the French needed at the time.
The North Atlantic cod fishery quickly became by far the biggest fishery in the world, key to the growing wealth of France and England's American colonies.
It became the fourth harbor in importance in North America by the 1740s, and in that sense created jealousies, created a certain number of problems, as well as opportunities for profit with the New England merchants. And people in, say, Newport, Rhode Island were actually outclassed by Louisburg because the harbor was getting bigger and profiting more and more. Year after year, you'd have large fleets coming here. The French East India Company would sometimes have 15, 20 ships in the harbor. It was really becoming quite a trade center.
The inevitable conflict which occurred really had as its basis this whole question of economic competition. Who could control the cod fishery and who could most profit from it? Louisburg was ideally situated to be a transshipment point. Cargoes could come north from the Caribbean or really come north as from the South Atlantic, arrive at Louisburg, and there prepare itself then for the great crossing of the Atlantic to the ports of France.
The last ships would come here at the Lake Falls and leave, and because in the winter, of course, unnavigable, the seas are very bad. Indeed, people who landed here and they spend their first winter here would have been pretty dreary.
20 miles away, you can be in bright sunshine. In Louisburg, you can be surrounded by fog, days of fog, of rain, of changeable climate, and so on. People complain bitterly of the weather, particularly those who were sent here for any length of time. It was very much an isolation post, something that we would call a hardship post. No question of riding in a coach to gardens and walking on Saturday afternoons and being entertained by musicians outside and things of that sort, and enjoying the carefully cultivated gardens of the chateau in France and so on. None of that was here. By and large, you were hungry for news from France. Ladies would have been desperate to hear of the new fashions and so on, but the information came only every so often.
A soldier in the Compagnie Franche was enlisted for 6 years, on paper. You were enlisted in France and thought that going to the colonies was a great thing, and of course you were going to make a lot of money and marry an Indian princess and the rest of it. Years go by, and 6 years go by, and you say, well, I want to go home. The authorities might tell you, no, you're staying here. Why? Because there's not enough soldiers in garrison. When they did get their releases, they were allowed to go back to France. They didn't stay as settlers. Unlike in Canada and Louisiana, which were offered land grants and so on, and in Louisburg, most of the men went back.
There were compensations, like the local taverns, but they were rough and ready, suitable more for soldiers and sailors than family men and women. Hundreds of sailors would arrive from the French warships or fishing fleet, well stocked with money and a burning desire to spend it. They could buy wine, women, and song, and then broke again, look for the next ship out.
Life here was certainly not for a settlement, but for commerce and for simply being a naval base.
Louisburg was under the control of the governor, usually a high-ranking naval officer, and the social structure of the town was not very different from towns in Brittany or anywhere along the French coast on the other side of the Atlantic. Unlike the New England colonies, Louisburg was a far more structured, bureaucratic society, a place established by government and run by government. People at the level of gentlemen or officers could write home for goods. All had to be shipped from France. If you were upper middle class, you would do everything you could to make sure that your life was lived in a fairly dignified manner. This was a class society.
There were tremendous tensions developing that were part of the whole process that led eventually to the French Revolution. You had a terrible division between the officers who wore blue uniforms in the French Navy and the officers who wore red. Red were nobility, blue were middle class, and often both sides would not talk to each other. You also had terrible animosities between those who carried the sword, the épée, and those who were the administrative officers. In microcosm that had been transferred here with some colorful addition of Indians and fishermen and so on.
So the fortress did not provide that freedom from the limitations of European society that was to be found in the New England colonies. The French, who were sent to Louisburg, had little incentive to settle permanently. Social life would come alive with the arrival of spring.
Ships would be coming in from Europe with news, with supplies, and with new people, and so that would bring up things a bit. It wasn't all dreary, certainly. In the summer, there would be quite a lot of traffic here. It seemed to have been a well-known city by the 1740s or so because of so much traffic that was going on here. Certainly the Americans by then were quite aware of the place, and during peacetime, all sorts of ships came here. So it was a port of call which was known and appreciated fairly rapidly. Otherwise, how would we explain that it prospered so quickly? It was only started building in 1720, and 25 years later, it's one of the largest ports in North America.
That 25 years or so, when Louisburg was at its prime, was due to the strength of those who lived here under such difficult conditions. These people from France maintained a thriving fishing port and naval base, successful enough to be a constant threat to the more populous British colonies to the south. Revenue poured into Louisburg from both the fishery and the lively trade with the mother country and the New England colonies to the south. That commercial success impressed the New England colonists. But so did the immense scale of the fortifications. At that time, the French were considered to be the masters of military architecture, and Marshal Vauban, who designed Louisburg, had an immense reputation as a builder of impregnable fortresses. The British and French were once again at war in 1744. To the aggressive and restless colonists of New England, the ever-threatening Louisburg, with its imposing appearance and rich commerce, now became a tempting target. And so, in March 1745, encouraged by Boston merchants, a volunteer army of perhaps 4,000 of the King's New England subjects sailed from Boston in 100 small ships to lay siege to the greatest French fortress in the New World. Curiously, these amateur soldiers were not in awe of the fortress, in spite of its fearsome reputation. Awaiting them in Louisburg was a garrison of tough, experienced troops, some of them Canadian-born, but under the leadership of officers of the French army. These troops had been seasoned by their many raids and skirmishes against New England towns.
Britain and France were hereditary ancient enemies, and this rivalry got carried to North America. So to some extent, in one way you could look at it, the attack on Louisburg was part of a long tradition of whenever there was a war on, you tried to attack the French possessions in North America. And the French as well would send raiding parties to try to attack the New England colonies.
The British government of the time were concerned about Louisburg, but only to the extent they're looking at a global strategy of competition with France. For the New Englanders, it was a whole different issue because North America was their home. Competition with the French was a matter of life and death for them, particularly as regards the cod fishery.
Many of the New England volunteers were fishermen, men who had hatched this daring expedition without professional military advice, and at first, without even promise of British help.
The expeditionary force had been recruited from the colonies of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, a real cross-section of New England society at the time, with especially heavy weightings in people from coastal communities who really saw the chance to drive the French out of Louisburg as something that would really benefit them economically.
They were a tough lot, these New England volunteers, rather sniffly described by a British naval officer as blacksmiths, barbers, shoemakers, and all the banditry them colonies affords. But they included wealthy merchants involved in the fish trade, as well as the sailors and fishermen who manned their boats.
And many of the New Englanders who came north with almost a crusading zeal to do away with the papist presence to the north. And at least one man was reputed to have carried an axe with which to chop to pieces the altar in the chapel. There was a lot of religious intolerance at work. There was the ancient fear, the enemy to the north. All these contributed to the New England enthusiasm, particularly from Massachusetts, for the attack on Louisburg.
The first contingents of approximately 4,000 colonial soldiers landed here at Kennington Cove and had been carried north from the New England colonies in a fleet of approximately 100 small sloops and schooners, and were joined, of course, by Peter Warren's Royal Navy Squadron. The Louisburg Expedition was the first really large-scale military expedition that New England would participate in, and laid the foundations of a military tradition in which they had the resources, the manpower, the wealth to mount an expedition of this size with very little help from London.
The fortress was set up to resist attack from the sea, through the harbor. But the French did not believe they were vulnerable to a land attack, and were surprised when the New Englanders landed at a cove a few miles west of the fortress.
This is where the first group of New Englanders actually hit the beach, so to speak. The landing site here is between 3 and 4 miles from the fortress walls.
The French troops in the garrison knew nothing about North American military tactics. They did not expect an amphibious landing on the beach and did not move in force to repulse it. They sent out only a small detachment of troops to investigate. But most units stayed in the fortress, preparing their shot and muskets and practicing to repulse a direct attack. The New Englanders had learned to fight in the woods as they were clearing the frontiers of their settlements, and had adopted many tactics from their Indian adversaries. But they had also worked out a flexible, democratic, and quick approach to fighting, very much like the guerrilla warfare of later generations.
The valuable thing about the New Englanders in 1745 is that they were amateurs. And so they brought amateur enthusiasm and a willingness to consider any option to a military situation. Often the professional military of the time would only think in terms of organized sieges, organized assaults, and so on. An untrained militia will say, how can we take that objective? Let's think of any way of doing it.
When the New England fleet arrived off Louisburg on the April 30th, 1745, just a few hundred yards up here, they encountered the small French party that had been sent out from the fortress to oppose the New England landing.
The small French party sent to investigate the landing discovered groups of New Englanders already pushing into the forest, and the two sides engaged in some firing back and forth. The French might well have repelled the New Englanders had they emerged from the fortress with a strong enough force. But they had built the fortress facing towards the sea and were confident that no one could mount a serious land attack through the swamps and forests surrounding them.
Given the odds, it was very unlikely that invaders would be able to bring heavy guns across that ground and set up batteries near the fortress walls.
The New England Army, however, defied the odds and exposed the weakness and the thinking of fortress designer Marshal Vauban. By going overland and not by sea, the New Englanders outflanked the immobile French troops in the fortress. Many New Englanders at Louisburg kept diaries.
Got some of the great artillery on shore and began to transport them, which was attended with incredible difficulty, there being no possibility of drawing them with horses or oxen. The enemy did not seem to apprehend the possibility of our transporting battering cannon over those grounds, but our men seemed resolved to surmount all difficulties.
Anonymous New England soldier, May 5th and 6th, 1745. By the end of the first day, parties of New Englanders were already in place, close enough to snipe with their muskets at the French troops manning the walls of the fortress. Already, the hard work of pulling the cannons through the marsh began to pay off. Now the French began to discover the inadequacies in the design of their handsome fortress.
When the French came to fortify this harbor, they were considering how to deal with essentially a naval threat. They weren't looking to defend the harbor area against an attack from the land. So what they had to deal with was a long kidney-shaped harbor with a very narrow opening right at the center. And what they determined to do was to place the town at the southwest end of the harbor on a narrow spit of land and fortify that. Then place a battery on the island which controls the narrow entrance into the harbor. As well, they were going to put another battery on the inner side of the harbor facing out towards its mouth.
To defend against attack from the sea, the traditionally trained French commanders ringed the harbor with gun emplacements. The biggest of these was not in the fortress itself, but stood on the shoreline overlooking the entire harbor.
The principal defense was a large battery called the Royal Battery or Grand Battery, located right here in a narrow V, or a shallow V rather, that faced outward into the harbor area. The French felt that they could control the harbor completely from any attack from the sea. The attacking forces did what the French did not expect anyone to do. They landed on the shores farther westward, marched inland, and encircled the harbor, thereby rendering the fortifications, which faced essentially seaward, useless.
The New Englanders had a good idea that they needed to land below the fortress because one of their initial objectives was to cut around behind the fortress up to the north shore of the harbor to seize the Royal Battery.
The Royal Battery was quickly decided at a council of war in 1745 to abandon it and to blow it up. However, the engineer who built it was part of the council, Verrier, and he pleaded and said, "No, don't blow it up, please."
Outflanked, the French decided to abandon the Royal Battery, and it was taken over by the New Englanders only 2 days after their landing on the beach. Now the siege of Louisburg began in earnest. The New England soldiers kept the French garrison behind the walls, under constant fire, and slowly were able to move their cannon closer to the town. Then, they poured heavy artillery into the fortress.
The New Englanders were very good gunners. They weren't all just country boys that hardly knew how to fire a shot.
The French were hoping for relief to arrive from France and were ready to hunker down and wait out their attackers. Unfortunately, the British naval presence was stronger than the French, and relief never arrived.
The naval force here wasn't strong enough at the time, in 1745, to actually repulse the British Royal Navy force that was sent up from New England. So, because the French at this time had not kept a strong squadron here, just a few ships. Most of them were still over in Europe and hadn't crossed yet. There was, in fact, one that came in during the first siege, and there was quite a battle with that one, a 64-gun large French ship, but ran into the Royal Navy, and that was that.
When you fired a cast iron ball from a smoothbore cannon with a charge of black powder, it might range as far as 3 miles. The problem was that beyond a certain distance, let's say a mile or so, it was almost impossible to say where the ball was going to go. So that accurate gunnery was not really very possible. The only way to be sure of hitting something was to get as close to it as possible, which is why in naval combat, usually the vessels got as close to one another as they could to exchange fire back and forth. So if you had several hundred men cramped into a small space inside essentially a wooden container, and then you fired large iron balls at that container, when they impacted into the vessel, not only was there damage from the ball, but the flying splinters were what caused the terrible damage. The only other fear that ships had what was called Hotshot. When in a battery like the Royal Battery, there would be small shot furnaces that would heat these cast iron balls to a glowing red-hot state, and a wet wad would be put in on top of the powder, and then this sizzling hot ball would be put into the gun and fired at a ship. And if it hit the ship and impacted and, say, wedged into the wood, of course, it was almost like putting a match into a tinderbox, and within a few seconds, the whole vessel could be ablaze.
Not only were the cannons inaccurate, but so too were the muskets, with an effective range of only about 60 yards. The tactics were to draw up in platoon or battalion formation and unleash volleys of shot. Since 100 muskets aimed in the same general direction were more likely to get results than any number of single marksmen. The French had the support of the local Micmac and Abenaki Indians, who did not like the New Englanders because the British colonists had come to North America to stay and had fought bitterly to take over Indian lands. But the help of the Indians was not enough. The French garrison was outnumbered, and it was merely a matter of time before the New Englanders and their English allies would take over the fortress. The New England force probably never had more than about 5,000 men, and although they were somewhat disorganized, their success in laying siege to such a powerful fortress was a remarkable testament to their energy.
There's some tremendous period views of towns under fire with mortar shells exploding. This is a 13-inch bomb. The shell itself would weigh just under 200 pounds, would be filled with approximately 7 pounds of powder, and was designed to explode. And of course the shell would break, and it would cause damage to lighter structures and particularly to people. One advantage a mortar gave to artillerymen was that the shell would explode, so you could actually see where your shot landed. In total, there's probably something over 50,000 pounds of mortar shell sent into the town.
The great aim of siege engineers at the time was not so much to get infantry troops close to a place to attack it, but more to get close enough where with artillery, and particularly the use of mortars and shell bombs, you could pound the place into submission. And that's exactly what happened at Louisburg. Because it could blow apart buildings, it could land anywhere and cause damage through the flying splinters and so on. So rather than being directly an anti-personnel thing, it was essentially a terror weapon.
The cannons, bombs, cohorns, etc., continually roaring on both sides. Women and children heard to screech and cry out in ye city when our bombs came amongst them.
Dudley Bradstreet, New England soldier, May 7th, 1745. Being in the open, the New Englanders were vulnerable to the fire from within the walls, and their casualties were about 100 dead. In those days, there was little help for soldiers wounded in battle, except for liquor to ease the pain, and it was common for wounded men to be left to die. The occupants of Louisburg now learned a bitter truth. Those who were unfortunate enough to be besieged in a colonial fort were almost inevitably doomed.
Active target in front! Single round! Fire!
The siege of Louisburg showed that the New England colonies had come of age. Their energy, wealth, and population had been mobilized to overcome the greatest imperial fortress in North America. The expedition had not been well planned. In fact, was rather ramshackle. But its verve, daring, and immense energy had carried it to the first impressive military victory the New England colonists had ever won. In only 6 weeks, start to finish, a great fortress fell to an amateur army of colonists.
The general went in and took possession of the city of Louisburg, the greatest conquest that ever was gained by New England.
Anonymous New England soldier, June 17th, 1745. Conditions for the New England volunteers in the captured Louisburg were so bad that by the end of the first winter of occupation, 900 men had died from disease. The following spring, the New Englanders were finally relieved by the British Army. The colonists achieved a great deal with their victory. Of course, they got rid of the French and their control over the thriving cod fishery, and dealt a blow to a hated religious enemy. But perhaps more importantly, the removal of the military threat also removed an argument for the British Army to remain in the colonies. Fate had in store an even more bitter blow for the New Englanders. Only 3 years after the colony soldiers had captured the fortress at such cost and hardship, the British handed it back to the French. France had captured Madras in India, and the British wanted it back.
The French came back considerably reinforced. The garrison was now much bigger. I think there had been 8 companies of soldiers before, now there were 24.
When the fortress was turned back in 1749 to the French, of course, the immediate reaction, particularly in Massachusetts, which was a hotbed of the Revolution, some years later, was, look at the effort we went to capture this place, which really we don't want to have around, and now you've handed it back because you've got concerns about property in India. British government would say, well, no, we have to balance everything, and we'll look after your interests, but we've got to worry about India too. We have profits to be made and so on. So there was already the beginning of an irreconcilable argument starting. So the impetus to take Louisburg by the New Englanders and the loss of it in 1749 probably was one of the beginning irritants that did lead to the American Revolution.
A decade later, the game had changed again. For the second time, the British laid siege to Louisburg in 1758, determined this time to drive the French out of North America. Now, the full power of the British Army and Navy was mobilized, concentrating thousands of men and dozens of ships on blockading the port. This time, the colonists were not involved.
During the 1758 attack, when the British boats were coming ashore and rowing towards the sandy beaches of Kennington Cove, the French waited until the boats were quite close in and then opened up such an intense fire that the British boats turned away, thinking that the attack was impossible. But 3 boats spotted a small rocky beach. James Wolfe saw them heading towards it, realized that that small bit of rocky beach was sheltered from the French guns, and he rowed for it as well, signaling to the other boats to follow him. The siege of Louisburg was won by James Wolfe's audacity, and the first demonstration of that audacity was on that 35 or 40-foot stretch of rock where James Wolfe splashed ashore. When the English arrived in 1758 and the British Army and the Royal Navy arrived, they had some 13,000 men, and it was an enormous undertaking. And yet it was remarkable to French eyes in particular that such a large force should take so long in taking the fortress, when the New Englanders in 1745 had wrapped up the job in 6 weeks.
In 1758, the British were more cautious. But within a day or two, the attacking forces began the assault on the fortress.
Madame Drucour, who was the governor's wife in the second siege, to encourage the soldiers, would go out and fire a gun every day. So naturally, the British general on the other side made sure that when she came out to fire her gun, they wouldn't fire at her. So the British battery would stop, and she'd fire her gun, and the French guys would cheer, and she'd go back.
The French, of course, had lost the fortress. But to those who ran the fortress, there was something more important. In the 18th century, if you lost an objective, you could always win it back the next year. But you must never give up your social standing, because that was ordained by God. Having once again captured the great fortress, the British now had to decide what to do with it. This time, the war between the two nations was taking place around the globe, and neither could be sure of winning. It was conceivable even that the fortress might once again fall into French hands. So the British decided to destroy the town of Louisburg and deport the entire population back to France. The fall of Louisburg sealed the fate of the French Empire in North America. The following year, Quebec fell to General Wolfe. To ensure that the French never came back to Louisburg, the British decided to get rid of the fortress. February 9th, 1760, the Prime Minister of England to the commander of the British forces in North America.
The King is come to a resolution that all the fortifications of the town of Louisburg be forthwith totally demolished and razed, and all the materials so thoroughly destroyed as that no use may hereafter be ever made of the same.
By 1760, Louisburg lay in ruins and stayed that way for 200 years. Both sides in the imperial struggle the French especially, had poured vast resources into this outpost that had dominated the battle for North America for 4 decades. 4 decades, one might think in retrospect, of the theater of the absurd. Buried in those destroyed foundation stones were the coins sent by the King of France in 1720, depicting a youthful Louis XV on one side and the Louisburg he was going to build on the other. The King's dream was revived only when the Canadian government decided to restore the fortress in the 1960s, exactly 200 years after the British demolished it. The idea was to employ 800 displaced local miners who had been thrown out of work. The restoration was one of the most impressive ever undertaken, and was carried out with such meticulous historical accuracy that it now draws thousands of people from across the continent every year to relive a turbulent period in our history. Louisburg was worth preserving. It had played an important role in developments leading to 2 of the most significant events of the last 300 years, the French and the American revolutions.
The Americans, when they captured this town in 1745, it gave them a tremendous sense of confidence. Louisburg may have had something to do with the sparkling of the idea of an independent people in the United States.
In France, you had an increasingly bankrupt government through the 18th century, finally running out of gas and faced with a social upheaval that they simply couldn't control by the end of the century. Both the cost of Louisburg and the loss of Louisburg helped pull one of those legs out from under the tottering structure that was the Kingdom of France.
Sure, it cost money, but when you start looking at fortifications across France that was built at the same time and the enormous expenditure that just a couple of ships of war would cost, there was nothing here in 1715, and by 1740, this must have brought out a lot of revenues and also a lot of safety for the ships that were going back and forth. Sure, it cost money, but it certainly didn't ruin France.
For the English, it was a key moment, a key pinnacle in their nation's history. And it resulted in the gaining of most of a continent.
As far as France is concerned, they could live without Louisburg. But there's a bit of an irony that, say, 30, 40 years later, they come to the aid of the Americans. And those same Americans that had first brought their military experience and their confidence here in Louisburg.
The Louisburg Campaign, which started here in this beach, marked the beginning of a violent and turbulent period in the history of North America, which would lead in 1760 to the fall of New France and would, several steps further, eventually lead to the American Revolution.